Millions of soldiers didn't die because they lost battles. They died because they were not allowed to fall back. They held their ground in cities reduced to rubble, in defensive lines that no longer mattered, in encirclements with no way out, all because of one single order: fight to the last man. This is not a story about cowardice or conventional military failure. This is a story about how a political ideology, once turned into a doctrine of war, silently destroyed an entire army from within. If you're drawn to history told slowly, deeply, and without clickbait headlines, subscribe to this channel now. Because what's coming is more than just history. It's a warning about the cost of blind power. Millions of German soldiers entered the final years of World War II with a truth they didn't need a map to see. This war had no way out. They were no longer fighting to win, nor clinging to hope for a turning point. What kept them in the trenches, in besieged cities, in forests cut off from all supply lines, was not military belief, but an absolute command. A command that forbade retreat, forbade trading space for time, and forbade admitting that some battles no longer held meaning. On the Eastern Front, there were divisions that existed only on paper, long since dead in reality. They were surrounded from all sides, out of artillery, out of fuel, incapable of maneuver. The soldiers knew full well that holding their positions no longer slowed the enemy, no longer protected the rear, and no longer provided any strategic value. And yet, they stayed. Not because they believed the ground could be held, but because retreat meant becoming criminals in their own army. The cruelty of this order wasn't in demanding sacrifice. Every war demands that. Its cruelty lay in making death mandatory, even when that death served no military purpose. Positions that should have been abandoned to reorganize became graves for entire units. Cities that should have only been temporary holding points were turned into fortresses, where garrisons were left behind to be completely destroyed. What's more terrifying is that most of these soldiers knew exactly what was happening. They weren't fooled by slogans of victory. They knew the Red Army held overwhelming advantages in numbers and firepower. They knew reinforcements would never arrive. And they knew that fighting to the last man was not a tactic, it was a sentence already written. But in a system where orders stood above lives, understanding didn't help you survive. The great question of history is not why the German army lost. Given the balance of forces and the length of the war, defeat was nearly inevitable. The real question is why that defeat had to come at such a devastating internal cost. Why did an army once famous for mobility and tactical flexibility, for knowing when to retreat and when to counterattack, end up trapping itself in dead positions? And why were these obvious mistakes not only left uncorrected, but elevated into rigid doctrine? The no-retreat order is often seen as a desperate move in the final months of the Third Reich, but that's far too simple. In fact, it didn't emerge only when Berlin was under direct threat. It wasn't the panicked reaction of a leader on the verge of losing. It was the result of a mindset formed long before, nurtured over many years, reinforced by both victory and defeat. To understand why hundreds of thousands of soldiers were forced to die in positions that could not be held, we have to look beyond the battlefields of World War II. We have to go back to a time when Germany still believed it had never truly lost. A time when defeat wasn't explained through military analysis, but through emotion, bitterness, and a sense of betrayal. It was from that moment that the very idea of retreat became synonymous with shame, while pointless sacrifice was draped in the robes of honor. This war, then, wasn't decided only by tanks, artillery, or industrial output. It was shaped by a psychological wound that never healed. And when that wound became the foundation of strategic thinking, war ceased to be the art of adaptation, and became a series of sacrificial rituals drawn out until there was nothing left to offer. To understand how a single command could destroy an empire and still be accepted, we must return to the beginning of that obsession. Back to 1918, where a defeat never fully acknowledged sowed the seeds for a tragedy that would span decades. In November 1918, the guns on every front suddenly fell silent. For the German soldiers still standing in their trenches, this wasn't the moment of obvious defeat. It was a strange, hollow emptiness. They hadn't seen the enemy march through Berlin. They hadn't been pushed back to their homeland. Many units still held formation, still had weapons in their hands, and still believed that if given the order, they could keep fighting. And then, in a single moment, the war ended with a signature, far behind the lines. This disconnect between the experience at the front and the political decision at the rear created a deep psychological wound. For millions of returning veterans, defeat didn't appear as shattered armies. It took the shape of a nagging question: why did we stop? In that void, reason didn't have time to speak, while emotion quickly reached for a more comforting explanation than reality. Germany didn't lose because it was weak. Germany lost because it was betrayed. The stab-in-the-back myth wasn't born in a historian's office. It was born in beer halls, in the conversations of disoriented soldiers, in the bitterness of a society unwilling to face the truth that the war had been lost from the ground up, economically, strategically. It was simple, easy to remember, and comforting. The fault didn't lie with us, but with those who had weakened our will to fight. To someone like Adolf Hitler, that myth wasn't just an explanation, it was absolute truth. He didn't experience 1918 as a military conclusion, but as a personal humiliation. In Hitler's worldview, Germany had never been defeated on the battlefield. The collapse came from within, from weakness, from those too soft to endure sacrifice to the bitter end. From that moment on, defeat was no longer a matter of tactics or logistics. It became a moral failure. Retreat was no longer a rational military tool, but a sign of spiritual decay. Compromise was no longer a political measure. It became a sin. And if the war had supposedly been lost due to a lack of will, then the next war would be waged with absolute will, unyielding, unwavering, unwilling to back down. Throughout the 1920s, that mindset was nurtured and sharpened. Hitler repeatedly claimed that Germany in 1918 hadn't lost due to a lack of weapons, but due to a lack of belief. And when a nation believes it was defeated because it was weak, its natural instinct next time will be to prove its strength at any cost. From there, sacrifice was no longer a tragic consequence of war, but proof of power. When Hitler rose to power, that psychological wound wasn't healed, it was institutionalized. The military, once a professional body trained to assess situations with cold analysis, was drawn into a new ideological space where personal loyalty mattered more than strategic reasoning. Oaths were no longer sworn to a constitution or an abstract nation, but directly to one man. And from that moment, any tactical disagreement could be interpreted as spiritual betrayal. The early victories of World War II only distorted the trauma of 1918 into a dangerous lesson. Poland collapsed quickly. France fell in a shock that stunned the world. Each victory became living proof that Hitler's instincts were correct, that willpower and boldness could crush outdated military theory. Cautious generals were pushed aside. Warnings about supply limits, strategic depth, or long-term risk were dismissed as signs of a 1918 mindset reappearing. Gradually, within the command structure, a dangerous habit took root. Not everyone believed in these doctrines, but fewer and fewer dared to speak up. Battlefield realities were presented in more palatable ways. Reports were softened. Worst-case scenarios went unspoken. Because in a system obsessed with betrayal, speaking truths no one wanted to hear could mean destroying your career or your life. The wound of 1918, then, didn't just live in memory. It seeped into every decision, every order. Every proposal to retreat was judged through the lens of that past failure. Every meter of ground left behind was felt not as a tactical adjustment, but a spiritual regression. And as the war entered its most brutal phase, the obsession didn't lessen, it grew fiercer. It was at this point that history veered into dangerous territory. When the fear of repeating 1918 became the guiding compass, military doctrine was no longer built on battlefield realities, but on psychological obsession. War ceased to be a calculation of force, space, and time. It became an ideological test of will, where retreat meant committing the same historic sin again. From one unresolved memory, a new ideology began to form. And as that ideology gradually replaced professional military thinking, war itself entered a new phase, where political belief didn't just guide strategy, but directly replaced the very principles of the art of war. When ideology begins to enter the map room, military doctrine doesn't vanish overnight, it goes silent. On paper, the principles of modern warfare remain: mobility, concentration of force, preservation of manpower, flexibility in the face of reality. But in practice, those principles gradually take a back seat. The question guiding decisions is no longer, how do we win? But how do we avoid repeating 1918? In Hitler's worldview, war was not the art of managing risk. It was a test of will. An army that retreats, no matter how justified, carries within it the seeds of decay. And if decay had once killed Germany, it had to be eliminated from the start, with iron discipline and absolute obedience. From here, military thinking came under the surveillance of political belief. Nazi ideology didn't see war as a clash of weapon systems, but as a struggle for survival between races and wills. Within that logic, flexibility was seen as wavering. Cost-benefit calculations were seen as lack of resolve, and retreat, even temporary, was interpreted as the first step toward betrayal. Concepts that were once neutral in military terms were now assigned moral value, and once moralized, there was no more room for debate. This fundamentally changed the role of a commander. Once, a general was judged by his ability to read situations, adjust plans, and preserve forces for future battles. Now, the most important trait was ideological loyalty. A militarily sound decision that contradicted the Führer's will could be more dangerous than a flawed one that displayed hardness. In that environment, personal safety and career survival depended on following orders, not on results in the field. And so war began to operate like a political ritual. Every meter of gained ground became a symbol that could not be relinquished. Every city held became proof of spiritual strength. When reality called for a tactical pullback and regrouping, the command apparatus was pressured to hold firm, to demonstrate will. And the more they held, the more vulnerable they became to an enemy who knew how to exploit depth and firepower. The danger of this process wasn't in one particular order, but in how it unfolded step by step, almost imperceptibly. At first, ideologically driven decisions still yielded results. Bold campaigns were launched, the enemy caught off guard, victories came quickly. This convinced Hitler that his intuition surpassed all military theory. Each win became new proof that willpower could replace analysis. But war doesn't stand still. As front lines expanded, as supply chains stretched for thousands of kilometers, as the enemy adapted instead of collapsing, material limitations became impossible to ignore. That's when military doctrine should have returned to the forefront, to offer necessary corrections. Instead, ideology tightened its grip. Every setback was framed as a test of resolve. Every cautious proposal was seen as a sign of weakening faith. Within the command structure, a silent atmosphere took shape. Generals understood that telling the truth was not always the safe choice. Reports were filtered through layers of euphemism. Phrases like "serious difficulties" replaced "we cannot hold." Bleak forecasts were delayed or blurred, not because the danger wasn't seen, but because the system could no longer process information that contradicted its core beliefs. By now, ideology wasn't just guiding war, it had begun to replace military doctrine. Decisions were no longer weighed across strategic options, but chosen based on how well they fit the regime's narrative about itself. War became a stage to showcase willpower, and soldiers became props in the performance. This replacement was especially dangerous because it created the illusion of control. When everything is explained through spirit and belief, failure is never a sign of flawed strategy. It's merely proof that more sacrifice is needed. And in such a logic, there's no natural stopping point. No moment when one can say, we need to change how we fight. Every defeat only leads to a call for greater sacrifice. It was here that the order "no retreat" shifted from reflex to dogma. At first, it was applied selectively, a way to force units to hold under pressure, but over time, it became the default principle, applied in every situation. Retreat no longer needed justification to be forbidden. It was banned because the act itself had come to be seen as inherently wrong. Once dogma took root, war entered a new phase. The space for correction disappeared. Mistakes were no longer seen as chances to adjust, but as tests of loyalty. And in such a system, one uncorrected mistake inevitably led to another, larger, deeper, harder to reverse. All of this could persist for a long time, as long as reality didn't force the system to confront its own limits. That reckoning didn't come through a single lost battle, but through an accumulation of pressure, distance, cold, exhaustion. It came when the war no longer unfolded under conditions that willpower alone could mask. It came in winter, when nature and the enemy simultaneously posed questions that ideology couldn't answer. And it was in that winter, in 1941, that the true nature of these once celebrated decisions began to reveal itself. Mistakes were no longer exceptions, they became the rule. And from that moment on, the dogma of no retreat locked the German army onto a path with no way back. The winter of 1941 did not come as a surprise to those who understood Russia, but it struck like a death blow to a command structure that had convinced itself willpower could replace all planning. When the first icy fronts swept down on the Eastern Front, the war that Nazi Germany had envisioned as a blitzkrieg morphed into something entirely different. No longer a chase after a crumbling opponent. Now it was a prolonged confrontation with distance, time, and the endurance of a nation that knew how to suffer. At that moment, German army groups had already pushed hundreds of kilometers deep into Soviet territory. Supply lines were stretched to dangerous lengths. Vehicles were running out of fuel. Winter clothing hadn't been distributed. Many units still wore summer uniforms as temperatures fell below freezing. Reports from the front grew increasingly grim, not due to morale collapse, but because material reality was choking the army's ability to fight. This should have been the moment for military doctrine to speak up. A structured withdrawal, shortening of lines, consolidation of logistics, and waiting for the next campaign season was the most rational option. Many generals knew it. They saw the danger of units freezing in place, slowly worn down by the cold, and the Red Army's increasingly bold counterattacks. But those assessments were no longer being received the way they once were. Hitler saw the winter of 1941 not as a tactical challenge, but as a test of spirit. To him, falling back in the face of nature and the enemy was tantamount to admitting that German willpower was not strong enough. And if 1918 had proved that even a moment of hesitation could lead to collapse, then 1941 would prove the opposite. There must be no hesitation, no matter the cost. The orders were issued. Hold your positions at all costs. No retreat, no regrouping, no adjusting the lines to fit reality. Units that had advanced too far, who should have been allowed to fall back to more defensible positions, were forced to stand firm in skin-cracking cold. Tiny villages and ridgelines with no long-term strategic value suddenly became last-stand locations, simply because they had already been taken. The consequences didn't come as one massive catastrophe. They came slowly, steadily, and mercilessly. Soldiers began to freeze to death in their trenches. Weapons jammed from the ice. Tanks wouldn't start. Artillery lacked shells. Each passing day, combat capability eroded, but no new orders came. Because to admit a need for adjustment was to admit the original decision was wrong. It was here that a tactical mistake became dogma. The no-retreat order, which could once be interpreted as a temporary necessity, was elevated into a universal principle. It no longer needed to prove its effectiveness. It existed as a symbol of will. And when a decision is protected by symbolism, all evidence to the contrary becomes meaningless. The winter of 1941 also marked a shift in how Hitler intervened in the war. He no longer just set broad objectives. He began meddling in individual details, unit positions, and every decision to hold or withdraw. The battlefield map became a stage where personal willpower completely overrode professional evaluation. Generals, once accustomed to autonomy, were reduced to order followers, even when they saw disaster approaching. The most dangerous part was that, in some cases, holding ground in the winter of 1941 yielded short-term success. A few defensive lines did hold against initial Soviet counterattacks. Stories of German willpower unbroken by the Russian winter were widely spread in propaganda, and these isolated successes helped blur the bigger picture, reinforcing the dogma even more. But the real price was paid beneath the surface. The German army didn't just lose men, they lost mobility, lost the initiative, and more importantly, lost the habit of adapting to reality. From that winter forward, retreat was no longer seen as a legitimate military option. It became taboo. And when an action is banned ideologically, every consequence of not doing it is accepted as fate. The winter of 1941 then was not just a weather trial. It was the moment Nazi Germany's war crossed a point of no return in terms of mindset. From then on, every time reality called for flexibility, the command structure answered with more rigidity. Every time a line needed adjusting, orders demanded it be held harder. And every time that happened, the cost grew higher. By the time spring arrived, the German army still existed, but it had changed, not toward adaptation, but toward confinement. The lessons that should have been drawn from the winter of 1941 were not learned. Instead, they were twisted into proof that with enough hardness, any difficulty could be overcome. And armed with that dangerous belief, the German army marched into the most brutal phase of the war, in a theater that would not forgive repeated mistakes. The Eastern Front, with its vastness, brutal pace, and an opponent that learned and evolved, would soon prove that war is no place for unchanging dogma. But by the time that lesson was written in blood, the capacity to learn it was already gone. The Eastern Front was not a battlefield in the way the German army had previously known. There were no clear boundaries, no truly safe rear lines, and no rhythm that allowed an army to pause and catch its breath. It was an immense space where distance was measured in hundreds of kilometers, time stretched to exhaustion, and even the smallest mistake could be magnified into catastrophe. In such a space, only one principle ensured survival: flexibility. And that very principle was systematically eliminated. After the winter of 1941, the German army entered a war of attrition it was never prepared to fight. The Red Army was no longer a force in disarray, retreating in panic. They learned quickly, reorganized swiftly, and more importantly, they had the space to fall back, regroup, and counterattack. Every time the German lines stood still, the enemy gained time to encircle, build up firepower, and choose where to break through. Meanwhile, German forces were bound to fixed positions, ordered to hold at all costs, even as their military value faded. The Eastern Front punished rigidity with brutal precision. Units not allowed to withdraw when the chance was there were soon forced to fight when no way out remained. Positions that should have been held only temporarily to delay the enemy became sites of last stands. And each time, it wasn't just soldiers lost. It was experience, cohesion, and the combat effectiveness of entire units that vanished. What made the tragedy even more profound was that most German commanders understood exactly what was happening. They saw the consequences of inflexible orders coming. They knew that in the deep war of the Soviet Union, preserving manpower mattered more than holding ground. But that knowledge held no value in a system where decisions came preordained from above. The Eastern Front allowed no debate, and the command system allowed no adaptation. From 1942 onward, the imbalance became glaring, not just in troop numbers or industrial output, but in the ability to learn from mistakes. The Red Army could lose an entire army group, then adjust their strategy. The German army, in contrast, was forced to repeat the same mistakes, just on an ever larger scale. Each failure didn't lead to reform. It led to harsher orders. On a battlefield where distance could swallow entire corps, holding a single fixed point often meant cutting off your only path to survival. German defensive lines became overstretched, thin, and lacked depth. When a Soviet offensive broke through one segment, the surrounding units weren't allowed to fall back and form a new line. They had to stay put and wait to be encircled. And once the circle closed, the only option left was to fight until annihilation. The Eastern Front thus became a machine of attrition. Not because the German army lacked courage or skill, but because they were forced to fight in exactly the way their enemy wanted. The Red Army learned how to exploit that stillness. They didn't need to destroy every unit in direct combat. They only needed to isolate, encircle, and let time and firepower do the rest. Rigidity also eroded the bond between officers and their men. When a soldier understands he's being asked to die, holding a position that has no real value, belief in the purpose of the fight begins to vanish. What replaces it is the creeping sense of meaningless sacrifice. This can't be measured in statistics, but it eats away at morale slowly and relentlessly. Meanwhile, the command apparatus behind the lines grew increasingly detached from reality. Maps became substitutes for the battlefield. Arrows and defensive symbols were drawn without regard for actual conditions. And when a war is directed from that far removed, holding a city, a crossroads, or a hilltop becomes more about symbolism than the lives of those stationed there. From this logic, The Eastern Front began to witness a dangerous transformation. Positions that could not be held long-term were redefined. They were no longer temporary strongpoints. They were given a new name: fortresses. Once labeled a fortress, a position could no longer be abandoned. It had to be held to the last man, not because it would decide the war, but because losing it would harm the story of unbreakable will. At first, this concept was applied selectively. A few cities were designated to be held at all costs, to anchor the front. But in the conditions of the Eastern Front, each of these fortresses did little to slow the Soviets. They simply became pockets of troops, waiting to be surrounded. And each pocket that was wiped out weakened the German line even further. The irony is that the more fortresses fell, the stronger faith in the doctrine became. Each time a city was encircled and destroyed, the explanation was never that the doctrine was flawed. It was always that the forces weren't sufficient, the morale wasn't high enough, the sacrifice wasn't total. And so the solution was never to abandon the idea, but to create more fortresses. The Eastern Front, a place where vast space and relentless pace left no room for inflexibility, was forced to operate under a logic completely at odds with its reality. And it was that very contradiction that gave rise to one of the most brutal doctrines of the war. When a city was no longer viewed as a temporary holding point, but as a symbol that must not fall, the fate of those inside was sealed long before the battle began. From that point on, the war entered a new phase where cities were no longer living spaces or tactical nodes, but enormous traps. And within those traps, an entire generation of German soldiers would be buried, along with the belief that to stand still was strength. The fortress doctrine was not born from cold military analysis. It was born from a fear of losing control. As the Eastern Front was continuously fractured and the vast expanses of the Soviet Union made every defensive line feel fragile, the German command began searching for something that felt more stable than maneuverability. They found it in cities. Urban areas with buildings, roads, and political symbolism were seen as anchors that could hold the front in place. On paper, the idea made sense. In practice, it became one of the deadliest mechanisms of destruction within the German army itself. Once a city was labeled a fortress, it ceased to be a flexible tactical space. It became a symbol. And once a location becomes symbolic, it cannot be allowed to fall. It didn't matter if the city still had logistical value. It didn't matter if supply lines were intact. It didn't matter whether the defenders still had the ability to fight. The only thing that mattered was that the city held firm on the map for as long as possible to prove that German will had not been broken. In reality, these fortresses often lacked everything needed to endure a prolonged siege. They weren't prepared for isolation. Food supplies were limited, ammunition was insufficient. Defenders were often units already worn down by months of continuous combat. But the orders were crystal clear: hold no matter what. And when the Red Army encircled them, the fate of the defenders was all but sealed. The fortress doctrine created a cruel paradox. In theory, holding cities would slow the enemy, forcing them to divert forces to surround and eliminate each strongpoint. But in practice, the Red Army learned to exploit this strategy. Rather than storming these fortresses head-on, they cut them off, severed their supplies, and let time, hunger, and artillery do the rest. Each fortress that fell wasn't just a tactical loss. It was the total erasure of a force that might have otherwise been redeployed to fight elsewhere. What's most striking is that the soldiers inside these fortresses usually understood their predicament all too well. They knew there would be no reinforcements. They knew that, at best, airdropped supplies might buy them a few extra days, and they knew the order to hold wasn't a promise of victory. It was an acceptance of death. But in a system where retreat was equivalent to betrayal, that understanding offered no way out. From the command's perspective, the doctrine offered one major benefit: simplicity. No complex calculations. No need to embrace the uncertainty of mobile warfare. Just designate a location as a fortress and issue the order to hold. All responsibility for failure was pushed downward, blamed on those who weren't strong enough. And it was that very simplicity that allowed the doctrine to spread like a habit. But the cost was the slow internal collapse of the army. Elite units were wiped out in encirclements, experienced officers were killed or captured. Those who survived carried with them a bitter lesson. Being a skilled fighter no longer mattered. Obedience did. And once the army internalized that lesson, its ability to self-correct, vital in any war, began to disappear. The fortress doctrine also completely warped the concept of responsibility. A city encircled and destroyed was not seen as a strategic failure. It was praised as a heroic sacrifice. Stories of fighting to the last man were widely glorified, obscuring the fact that the very orders had placed soldiers in inescapable death traps. When death is sanctified as virtue, there is no room left to question its necessity. As time went on, the doctrine became increasingly mechanical. Not just major cities, but small towns, crossroads, even clusters of villages were turned into fortresses. The Eastern Front became dotted with isolated pockets of German troops, each one a mass grave waiting to be filled. And with every pocket lost, the overall strength of the German army declined more rapidly. The bitter irony is that the fortress doctrine was created to preserve the front, but it ended up accelerating its collapse. As more and more forces were pinned down and destroyed in place, there were no reserves left to plug holes or mount counterattacks. The front didn't shatter in a single decisive blow. It was hollowed out piece by piece until there was nothing left to hold it up. And during that process, another dangerous shift occurred silently. As the order to die in place became the norm, the command structure began to suffocate itself. There was no longer space for dissent, no more room for honest assessment. Reports from the front became increasingly divorced from reality, not because of a lack of information, but because truth had become unacceptable. The fortress doctrine, therefore, didn't just kill soldiers inside besieged cities, it killed the system's ability to adapt. And when a war is suffocated from within like that, it no longer matters how strong the external enemy is. The outcome has already been decided. Germany's war wasn't only worn down by an external enemy, it was suffocated from within, silently but no less brutally. As the fortress doctrine spread and orders to hold at all costs became standard, the first casualty was not the soldier, it was the truth. Battlefield reality became dangerous because it conflicted with the story the leadership wanted to hear. In a system where retreat equaled betrayal, no one had any incentive to report that the situation was hopeless. Frontline reports were trimmed, softened, even distorted, not because officers wanted to deceive their superiors, but because telling the truth meant inviting suspicion. When a career's survival depended on maintaining ideological faith, truth became a burden to be avoided. Gradually, a vicious cycle took shape. High command received reports more optimistic than reality, leading to orders increasingly disconnected from the battlefield. Those orders, in turn, forced subordinates to polish their reports further, to prove they were achievable. And so the gap between the map and the battlefield widened until they had nothing to do with each other. The war wasn't strangled by one catastrophic decision, but by the accumulation of silence. Questions stopped being asked, warnings stopped being heard. Veteran officers learned to say what needed to be said instead of what needed to be heard. And when a military loses the ability to critique itself, it has already begun to die, even if it still has men and weapons. At the soldiers' level, this suffocation took another form. Troops began to realize that their fate was no longer tied to their fighting skill or courage. It was tied to where they stood on the map and what label had been assigned to that position. Once a unit was declared a fortress, any hope of a rational survival path vanished. Fighting was no longer a means to achieve a goal. It became an obligation, even when the outcome was already set. Faith in the war's purpose eroded day by day, not through open rebellion, but through spiritual exhaustion. The soldier kept fighting, kept obeying orders, but inside, his motivation had shifted. He no longer believed his death would make a difference. He simply tried to survive one more day in a system that no longer valued that survival. Internal suffocation also distorted the very idea of responsibility. When a campaign failed, the cause was never traced to orders from above. Blame always fell on those who weren't strong enough, who lacked conviction. This explanation was simple and safe for the leadership, but it stripped the army of any ability to learn from failure. Because if defeat was always due to spirit, not strategy, then no change in decision-making was ever necessary. Over time, the German army didn't just lose soldiers, it lost its ability to coordinate. Units isolated in fortresses no longer operated as part of a unified front. Instead, they became scattered fragments, each fighting and dying alone. A war fought this way couldn't be run through rigid commands from the center, but that's exactly what continued. The tighter the grip, the more information flow was choked. The more detailed the orders, the less room for flexible response at the front. War, which demands constant adaptation, was turned into a mechanical sequence of actions. And once war becomes mechanical, it collapses the moment it meets an enemy that knows how to adapt. Eventually, even the most loyal figures could no longer hide the truth. Fortresses fell one after another, army groups vanished, gaps opened along the front faster than they could be filled. But instead of prompting a shift in thinking, these signs led to tighter control. When belief is threatened, the instinct of an ideological system is not to rethink, but to clamp down harder. It was in this stifling atmosphere that another kind of collapse began. Quieter, but perhaps even more dangerous than battlefield defeat. It was the collapse of trust among command levels, of faith in the decision-making structure, of the ability to conduct a war of this scale. When information no longer moves upward honestly and orders no longer flow downward sensibly, the command structure begins to fracture from within. The war had been suffocated for so long that by now, even the harshest orders no longer had effect. Not because people didn't want to obey, but because the system giving those orders had lost touch with reality. And from that suffocation, an irreversible process was now underway. The slow disintegration of the entire command apparatus, setting the stage for the final act of the tragedy. The collapse of the German command structure did not happen in a single day, nor did it begin with a coup or some dramatic turning point. It unfolded like a slow rot from within, where each small joint in the system gradually lost its function. Just as the war entered its most critical phase, the system that should have become more agile was instead pulled so tight it began to crack, all under the weight of absolute power and an obsession with control. At the heart of this collapse was a deadly paradox. Hitler believed that only his direct intervention could maintain discipline and fighting spirit. But the more he intervened, the more he paralyzed the system's ability to respond. Decisions once left to frontline commanders now had to be approved from a central headquarters thousands of kilometers away, a place where maps replaced mud, freezing winds, and corpses. War, in the hands of this apparatus, became a game of symbols and arrows, entirely detached from reality on the ground. The generals didn't lose their professional competence overnight. What they lost first was authority. Once all major decisions were pulled upward, the role of the field commander shrank into that of messenger. And when a commander is no longer allowed to decide, he gradually loses the motivation to take responsibility. Initiative, the lifeblood of warfare, was replaced by waiting for orders, even when those orders arrived too late. The collapse also showed itself in how the system responded to failure. In a healthy organization, failure forces reflection, adjustment, and learning. In the Nazi command structure, failure was interpreted as proof that tighter control was needed. Commanders weren't dismissed for strategic mistakes, but for lacking will. Personnel changes happened constantly. But the one thing that never changed was the logic of top-down decision-making. This created an atmosphere of permanent instability. No one knew how long their position would last. No one knew whether today's decision might be deemed betrayal tomorrow. In such conditions, creativity and intellectual courage, the very qualities a commander needs, were replaced by mechanical obedience. Personal safety became more important than battlefield success. Structurally, overlapping centers of power began to emerge. The regular army, the SS, party agencies, and Hitler's personal staff all coexisted, all issued orders, but not always in harmony. Instead of a clear chain of command, the battlefield was subjected to contradictory directives, sometimes directly canceling each other out. In a war that demanded speed and coordination, this kind of overlap was poison. The result wasn't just specific defeats, it was a loss of mutual trust across ranks. Subordinates no longer believed their superiors understood their situation. Superiors no longer believed subordinates would carry out orders in the right spirit. That gap made every decision heavier, slower, and less effective. War was being waged by a system that no longer believed in itself. At that point, even those who saw the disaster unfolding had no tools left to change it. The mechanisms for dissent had been dismantled. Warnings were dismissed as pessimism. Proposals for orderly withdrawal were seen as weakness. And when every path to adjustment is sealed off, the system is left with only one option: to continue on autopilot, no matter the cost. The collapse of the command structure then didn't happen with a loud crash, but with a long, hollow silence. Orders were still issued, reports were still filed, but between them, the living connection was gone. It was a system that still functioned in form, but had died in function. In that context, the people within the system began to be viewed differently. When the command structure could no longer adjust strategy, its only way to keep going was to throw more resources into the fire. And the easiest resource to throw was human lives. Destroyed units were no longer seen as losses to be avoided, but as the necessary price for prolonging the war a little longer. From the collapse of command emerged a new and even more ruthless logic. If victory could not be achieved through strategy, then survival must be bought through sacrifice. If a front could no longer be held with maneuver, then it would be held with bodies. The army, from this point on, was no longer a force to be preserved for long-term combat. It was treated as a reserve stock to be spent, and when a war reaches that stage, where human beings are treated as single-use units, the question is no longer if collapse will come, but when. From the ruins of the command system, the war slid into its final, darkest phase, where soldiers were consumed like fuel, and death became just another line in the plan. As the war entered its final phase, the German army was no longer seen as a body to be preserved for continued fighting. It was treated as a consumable resource, to be spent as needed in the moment. This shift didn't come from a single order, but from a gradual change in mindset. When every strategic path had been blocked, when the command system could no longer adjust course, the only thing left to throw into the war was human lives. New units formed during this period were no longer fully trained. Training times were shortened, equipment was scarce, experienced officers became increasingly rare. And yet these units were still sent to the front with the same demand: hold the line, do not retreat. No one still believed they could change the course of the war. Their real purpose was to fill gaps, buy time, and bleed the enemy with the brief flicker of their own existence. In this logic, losses were no longer something to be avoided. They were considered an acceptable cost. The destruction of a regiment was no longer a catastrophe to investigate. It was a number to be logged and quickly replaced with another, weaker, younger, less experienced one. The army became a conveyor belt where people entered at one end and disappeared at the other, leaving no lasting strategic imprint. For the soldier, this shift was deeply corrosive. They began to understand that survival no longer depended on how well they fought. It depended on whether they were unlucky enough to be thrown into a doomed fortress or trapped in a position already written off. Once a soldier realizes that their death has been pre-calculated as part of the plan, the will to fight inevitably distorts. Fighting spirit didn't collapse all at once, it eroded. Soldiers still obeyed, still held their ground, but the belief that their sacrifice served a higher purpose steadily faded. What remained was a sense of being used, tossed into battle to buy time for decisions they were not told, and that perhaps no longer existed. At the strategic level, this method of consuming the army created a deadly spiral. The more elite units were lost, the lower the army's overall quality became. The lower the quality, the more likely campaigns were to fail, and each failure triggered the same response from the system: throw more men into the fire rather than question how the war was being fought. The manpower shortage became increasingly visible. Conscription age was lowered. Men who'd once been deemed unfit for combat were sent to the front. Units were filled with recruits who didn't even understand what war really was, but the orders they received never changed. Still, hold the line. Still, no retreat. Still, fight to the last. The gap between what was asked and what was possible widened, and the only thing that could fill it was blood. Treating the army as a disposable resource also reshaped how responsibility was understood. When people become expendable, their deaths no longer provoke moral or strategic questions. They are rationalized in the language of necessity. And once death is considered necessary, there is no internal barrier left to stop it from repeating on ever larger scales. At this stage, Germany's war was no longer aimed at victory. It was aimed at delaying defeat. Each sacrificed unit bought one more day. Each city held to the last man bought one more week. But the time that was bought did not improve the strategic situation. It only made the end more painful, more costly, more meaningless. The most tragic part is that under this logic of attrition, even personal courage became hollow. A soldier might fight bravely, might hold his position longer than expected, but it rarely changed his unit's fate or the war's. He was no longer part of a strategy, just part of a depletion formula. And in that formula, every man was replaceable. When an army accepts the consumption of itself in this way, collapse is no longer a question of strength. It becomes a question of time. No system can endure when its input steadily declines in quality, and its output is relentless destruction. At this point, the war had lost all possibility of redemption. It kept moving forward, not out of hope, but because there was no mechanism left to stop. And it was in this condition that the German army reached the final edge of its existence, not defeated in a single decisive blow, but drained away piece by piece, unit by unit, man by man. When human resources were nearly exhausted, the only thing left was total collapse. No longer hidden, no longer postponed, and with no one left to bear the burden. When we look back at the full journey of the Third Reich during World War II, the most haunting part isn't the moment Berlin fell. It isn't the grand battles or the staggering casualty numbers. What lingers, what truly haunts, is a single, seemingly simple order, repeated so often it became almost natural. Do not retreat. That one command, more than any enemy weapon, eroded, hollowed out, and ultimately killed an entire empire from within. At its core, the order was born of fear. The fear of reliving 1918, the fear of spiritual collapse, the fear that even a single step backward would unravel the entire system. But fear, when left unchecked by reason, becomes dogma. And when dogma is handed absolute power, it no longer protects the system. It begins to destroy the very thing it was meant to preserve. The order to fight to the last man didn't make the German army stronger. It made it immobile. It stripped away its ability to adapt, the very quality that had once driven its early victories. It turned flexibility into a sin, tactical retreat into betrayal, and pointless death into a virtue. In a modern war, where victory hinges on learning and adjustment, such immobility was a slow execution. This empire didn't fall for lack of courage. German soldiers fought to the absolute limits of human endurance. It didn't fall for lack of military talent. Many commanders saw clearly what was happening and what needed to be done. It fell because all that understanding was crushed beneath an order that could not be questioned. And when questioning is forbidden, mistakes can't be corrected. And when mistakes can't be corrected, they repeat on an ever larger scale. From the frozen trenches of winter 1941 to cities turned into fortresses to entire army groups erased in silence, the same logic was applied as unchanged. Every defeat didn't trigger adjustment, but a demand for more sacrifice. Every loss didn't bring clarity, but tighter discipline. The war was no longer being fought to win. It was being fought to prove that the will hadn't broken, even when nothing was left to save. The cruelest irony is this: the order meant to prevent a collapse of morale caused the deepest collapse of all. When soldiers understood their deaths had been accepted in advance, morale could not be sustained by slogans. When officers knew that speaking the truth was more dangerous than telling leadership what it wanted to hear, the command system lost the ability to function. And when an army begins consuming itself like disposable fuel, its downfall no longer depends on how strong the enemy is, only on how many people are left to sacrifice. The fall of the Third Reich, then, was not just the failure of a military strategy. It was the failure of a way of thinking, a mindset that believed willpower could replace reality, that faith could replace logistics, that obedience could replace collective intelligence. History proved the opposite, at the highest imaginable cost. This lesson doesn't belong to Germany alone, nor to the Second World War. It stands as a timeless warning to all systems of power, military or political. When a system values obedience over truth, symbols over human life, and never backing down over survival, it is writing its own death sentence. It doesn't need a particularly strong enemy, just enough time. The war didn't end with the last bullet fired. It ended when no one dared to say the order was wrong. And when a command kills the ability to think, it has already the empire, long before the final flag comes down. If you have thoughts of your own about this historical lesson, leave a comment below. History is not just to remember, but to question, to discuss, and to reflect. And if you value slow, deep, and uncompromising analysis like this, don't forget to subscribe to History War as we continue uncovering the moments that shaped the world.